Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I had with Aleta McKeage. Aleta is a conservation biologist who has had, I think, a wonderfully winding path to her current work on assisted migration with regards to trees. I'm betting that statement has made you just as curious as I was when I heard about Aleta's work, which is what led to this conversation. We recorded this conversation in October 2024. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Today's episode is supported by Maine Technology Institute. MTI is celebrating 25 years of making grants, loans, and equity investments to businesses, organizations, and entrepreneurs to strengthen Maine's innovation economy. So, Aleta, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. This is actually the first time you and I are meeting. And I will say I reached out to you because a dear friend of mine went to a workshop you did. As soon as she got home, she said, you have to have her on your podcast. She is doing such cool stuff. So that was the inspiration, and I've been tracking you down to try to rope you into doing this conversation. So I'm really grateful that you said yes. I do know you're doing very cool stuff about tree migration and addressing climate change, and we will get to that. But first, I was hoping you could give us a quick overview of what drew you to science, and how did you get to the great state of Maine? How were we lucky enough to get you?
Well, thanks, Kate. I guess that I have been into science since I was 6 years old. No kidding. I always loved nature. I always had a little lab set up in my house. Bless my parents for getting little microscopes and things like that. So it was always just kind of a part of who I am. But I spent quite a few years as a high school teacher as my first career, and then decided I wanted to get into nature and really work on things related to ecology and the environment. So I went back to school, got a master's degree in conservation biology, and began that career in my 40s. So since then, I've been doing all kinds of work and slowly zeroing in on some work right now that I feel like is relevant to what's happening in the world and that engages a lot of people and not just scientists.
When you were teaching, were you teaching science? Like you said, microscopes, that's very chemistry oriented. And I think it's fantastic that your parents did that for you. I'm curious, like, what was your first gateway in?
Well, I would say that I got a bachelor's degree in natural resources and did study a lot of science, practical and applied science related to fish and wildlife management and forestry at that time, and ended up in teaching because I first worked in a nature center, and oddly, I was seeing different sets of kids each day, and I didn't feel like I could have the same impact as I might seeing kids over the course of months or even years. So I switched to teaching, and yes, I taught science, and it was a very winding road in my teaching career, but I eventually ended up working with immigrant students and bilingual students, helping them to navigate their high school courses, and it was very fulfilling for me, and I did it for almost 20 years.
What a cool track. I didn't expect to hear, well, I did informal science, and that's what we do at the museum, and it can be really great and rewarding, but you're right, it's really hard to see a long-term impact. I mean, you hope you do, but you have to rely on people to tell you. And then the immigrant piece is really fascinating. I did what I always do, which is a little bit of background checking, and I noticed that you were in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where our time actually overlapped. I lived there for a couple of years. So I was like, oh my gosh, I never talked to people who were in the same, like in Grand Rapids. And then we were lucky enough to get to Maine. My husband is a physics professor at UMaine, so you go where the academic jobs are. So how did you make your way here? Was it as a result of going back to school and then just being fortunate enough to find a place, or was it a conscious decision on your part?
Well, I had selected a graduate school that was going to allow me to shape my own research and my own program, and that was Antioch University, New England. And so I came out here to visit and see what it was like. Fell in love with New England immediately, like a lot of trees, a lot of mountains. And as you know, if you lived in Grand Rapids, which is a fairly industrial Midwestern area, another world. And of course, I knew this is where I was supposed to be. So I did grad school here. And I did find out that as you get into ecology and conservation biology, and you study a particular ecosystem or a particular region, that's a nice place to begin your career or perhaps establish your career because you're familiar with the biodiversity and the ecology of that area. So I wanted to stay in New England. And then I got to Maine because I got a job here.
All right, so let's dive in. One of the really interesting things in the conversation I had with this friend of mine was talking about the impact of climate change on forests, essentially, and how can you help I'm going to paraphrase it in the way I understand it. Basically, how can you help trees themselves adapt from the perspective of not the actual individual trees, but thinking about trees that will thrive and be okay in the climate that's coming? If I have that wrong, please correct me. But if you could kind of talk about what it is that you're doing in that regard and in the pursuit of understanding how to explain that type of work, that would be really great.
Yeah, I think you explained it very well. And looking at trees is kind of the very focused view of the work, because in science, as you know, we have to get down to particular questions. But it's really in the broader view about making sure that ecosystems can function in New England. And since this is a highly forested area, Maine is almost 90% forest. Trees are the basis for ecosystems structurally and otherwise. So it certainly seems like a place to do work to adapt to the climate. And as many of your listeners will know, trees in New England and in the United States and the world in general are facing a lot of threats right now. But we have relatively few tree species in Maine. And a lot of those species are facing threats that could lead to extreme decline or extinction by virtue of invasive pests like emerald ash or hemlock woolly adelgid, two insects that are not from North America and really do destroy populations of ash trees and hemlock trees, which are very important in our forest system. So looking at losses like that and other losses we've already had, like the chestnut trees decimated by blight and the elm trees likewise taken out by disease. Important trees are dropping out of our ecosystems. And as the climate warms, the other thing that's happening is trees that evolved here or came here after the glaciers were adapted to a cold, almost boreal climate in places. And so as it warms up, those trees go into decline, at least in terms of modeling, where in science we take a look at the data we have and the knowledge we have about things, and we sort of try to calculate the possible effects that might happen with different inputs. So in terms of modeling, a lot of trees here, such as our spruce, fir, birches, some of our cold climate trees are modeled to decline in the future. So if you think about that, a lot of the trees that live in Maine forests are likely to decline a lot. And each of those trees has function in our ecosystem for insects, birds, mammals, all kinds of species. And so as things go away, we are missing important pieces such as food, nuts, berries, mast that wildlife needs, for example. Insects are very specialized in terms of the plants that they can have their larvae on. And so as we lose tree species, things aren't there for the other things that live in our ecosystem, the animal species, and even other plants. So what's happening is I think that it is reasonable, and now it's becoming more acceptable to talk about the idea of moving species to help them adapt to climate change, because species, whether they're animals or plants, but particularly plants, cannot move fast enough to adapt to a changing climate. So we talk about helping them to move, and we call that assisted migration. And of course, there's some species such as birds that are already doing that themselves, but there's a lot of impediments to that, including fragmented landscapes and also the fact that we don't know exactly what the future climate is going to be. There's a lot of different factors that might change the end result. So right now, it's definitely worth studying which species might thrive here, starting to answer questions about, can they grow in the current climate as seedlings? Can they survive competition and browsing? So that sort of thing is what we're looking at now in research. And also we're selecting species to study. So it's really a fascinating area to work.
Are you putting in place managed plots of these assisted migrated species and then kind of seeing what happens in comparison to not plots that are already here, but like the impact on what do the insects do with it? What do the birds? So are you like putting in a plot and then seeing what happens?
Yes, there's definitely plot studies. Our initial study in the Mid-Coast area was working together with the Schoodic Institute to study specific species in randomized plots. And those trees are growing, and we look at their health, mortality, and we also look at insectivity or browse to see, what's happening to them in terms of their interactions with other species. And then variously, we might study competition or competition after initial protection. We oftentimes protect young trees from deer because deer will eat almost anything new and delectable. And so we aren't studying all impacts in the environment immediately. And we sometimes water trees the first year or the first 2 years, depending on environmental conditions. So there are some variables that we can look at now, and there's other things that won't be known for a while. Trees grow for 100 plus years. So it's my hope that future scientists will use the plots and the plantings we've done to look at other questions later on. Does the tree survive for decades? How does it start interacting with wildlife species? And eventually, will it naturalize and be able to spread seed and grow other trees of the same species in the natural environment? So there's a lot that can be learned from this. And right now, because these trees are young and we put these plots in within the last 5 years, we are looking at some simple questions about trees surviving at seedling and sapling stages in the current climate. So the climate factors change over time, the tree's age changes over time, and there's a kind of ongoing flow to the research possibilities that I find exciting.
So when you say competition, and then you mentioned the deer, are there other things that you're looking at? Are you also looking at competition from other trees that maybe are doing the same thing naturally, or the original trees that are there, or other animals? Or is it just about the deer?
Well, so in the case of the plots that we have, we initially open the site up a little bit so they don't immediately face competition from plant species at the understory and shrub and ground level. So they get a bit of a head start that way. And with the deer, we fence the trees typically. That has worked a lot better, up to about 5 feet, so they can kind of get above that height before they're dealing with the deer. And of course, insects are going to do what they're going to do. So we start looking right away at how much insect browse or insectivity we have on the plants.
Okay, so how far south are you pulling species from? Do you know what I mean? Like, I assume you're not just going to Massachusetts and picking them, or maybe you are. Like, what kind of migration are you looking at?
So the interesting thing about assisted migration is it really encompasses several levels of moving plants. You can move a plant northward within its natural range. So that's really moving a particular genotype to a more northern point, or you can move something just outside of its range. So we would call that range expansion. And you can also take a plant that is from a different place and move it quite a ways from its natural range. And that's what we would call formally assisted migration. So some of our trees are taking a leap in that respect. They live at points south, Connecticut, sometimes even south of there. And sometimes we are looking at range expansion, trees that live in southern Maine that realistically will probably grow well here, given the current climate, which is milder than it was 100 years ago. We're not really necessarily moving plants within their range right now in my studies, but we are moving some plants that are nearby natives. They're in New England somewhere. There's some really great work that is being done by the different researchers in our area to model which trees are likely to thrive here. And we often take that synthesis information and use that as a part of our choice of which trees to plant. And we combine that with some other factors too. We look at the potential for a tree to do something in the ecosystem that is dropping out. They're meeting an immediate need. And we also look at trees that may have some economic purpose in the forest economy, because we lose trees like, say, ash trees or other trees. that are harvested for timber or other forest products, it's nice to think about what might grow well here and quickly and provide for that need as well. So we sort of combine all of that and we select species to plant. And I would say right now, I'm planting species that I think that based on the modeling and a number of other factors, and we don't formally index those and calculate it, it is somewhat subjective. Sometimes I've seen that those trees can grow here already, and we plant those in our research plots. And we also have events where we allow people to get seedlings of these different species, plant them, and then report to us how they're doing as a sort of looping in community science into our work. So it's really exciting to, choose the species and then get them out there and see what's happening.
Are you looking at a combination of hardwood and softwood? I guess I'm thinking, as someone who, I don't know my tree species very well. I mean, I know the difference between hardwood and softwood. If someone happened upon some of your plots, would they think it was vastly different than what we already have? I mean, it sounds like you're doing what I would call incremental change. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that I like the assisted migration. Like you're just helping some species along because they cannot move as fast as we have changed the environment. So you're providing an assist. So do the plots and do the trees look, obviously we're not talking about palm trees here, but how different are they from what we're used to?
Yeah, we'll plant the palm trees in 100 years when our climate can use them, right? No, actually, it is incremental change because I think you have to look at what is reasonably going to work and not get too far afield of what the modeling says will work in this area. So those recommended trees are deciduous trees, more deciduous trees, or what you would call hardwood typically, than conifers right now. And there's a number of reasons for that. But unless you knew your trees, you wouldn't necessarily notice as these plots grow, and they will become then more blended into the ecosystem over time. That's our plan. You wouldn't really, notice anything after the deer fences are gone as far as the forest looking vastly different. It will look a lot like it does right now, but with potentially new species growing. So the research plots also become potentially an early restoration ecology experiment where they become a part of the system where they're growing. And as people plant these trees in all kinds of places, that's in a sense an expansion of the idea and starting to widely plant these species in anticipation of hopefully having things here in the next 50 years that are going to support our ecosystems.
So what made you go to this push for assisted migration and trying to stay, I don't want to say get ahead, but, we have impacted the environment, right? As soon as humans show up, the environment is impacted. And this seems like, the restoration piece. What made you decide that this was where you wanted to focus?
Well, in graduate school, I focused on restoration ecology to some extent. So I was interested in the idea that we have done so much to our landscape and we've changed so much that things have been degraded, that what could we do to start healing the landscape? And I was very interested in that. And I was interested in the idea that it was an approach that engaged more people than just scientists in doing something proactive and real on the ground to help the environment. So I was interested in restoration ecology. And I love trees. So as I started to see the effects on trees from some of what's happening, and this began for me in Michigan, where you probably know the emerald ash borer got started. And as I saw the way it decimated many of the trees in that system as it killed the ash trees, I said, this is terrible and this is going to have huge impacts. And I also saw that those kind of problems, they seem to march on inexorably across the country, and they're very difficult to stop. So I started to think a little bit about how we would do things to restore the environment as we lost tree species to these pests. And I'm certainly interested in the concept as well of what we might do in terms of genetics and hybridization and other factors to help some of those same trees return to the environment, such as hybrid elm trees. And, people are working right now on resistant ash trees. And I think that is a part of it too, the restoration of the same species over the course of decades. And that's exciting to me. And I think it's really a very highly manipulative way to deal with the environment, to plant new trees from elsewhere or genetically developed trees or hybrids. But I think at this point, we've done so much that all bets are off in terms of just letting the environment regrow or having places that are now conserved. I think we need to take a little bit of a more proactive hand in what's happening on the landscape. And I will mention, too, something that I'm sure many of your listeners think about, and that is that invasive plants are everywhere. And especially if you're in areas where there are towns and human populations, they can be very dominant in the landscape and start to inhibit native plants from growing. So looking at the fact that we're going to have to control invasive plants and possibly even plant things just to have a forest ecosystem on our landscape means that I think it's okay to start thinking about very deliberate ways we're going to do things to restore ecosystems.
Are you looking for communities to team up with you to continue this work? You said, you're bringing in the community scientist aspect of this, which is really, really cool. I mean, when you said you just love trees, I thought, oh, well, she is in the right state. She found the right place to live. But I'm also curious, are you kind of always interested in trying to get more public engagement with this and then kind of see how it's going? Is that something that you are actively looking for, or is that too much to manage?
Well, actually, that is a core part of the work that I'm trying to do. I would say that community science and getting people to help with both the research plantings and do their own planting and, come to events where they learn about these ideas. It's really critical because, as you know, we hear so much about the climate and it is just plain depressing. And a lot of people sort of despair that we're going to be able to deal with this problem. So getting people out planting trees and looking at ways that we can do things to restore the forest ecosystems is a way to work in the world of hope rather than despair. And it's something people can do. They don't just have to hear about it and say, wow, there's nothing I can do. There are things they can do. And so the community science doesn't just have a purpose of collecting more information or planting a larger volume of trees to study. It is about teaching people how to go forth in a world where the environment has a lot of pressures on it and there's a lot of problems, but to go forth with a kind of optimism, like we can work on this. And just like looking at human conflict and the ways we need to find peace in the world, we can also take action in the environment. So I am always involving community groups, towns, nonprofit organizations in this kind of work. In fact, we put some of our study trees at the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners land in Unity. And we also have plots on land trust preserves, and the land trusts are working with us. And I always have volunteers helping every step of the way. And as you know, I give talks on this as well.
So I realized we're deep into this conversation and I've yet to ask, how do you do your work? Like, how do people reach you? I know you work with land trusts and others. I can't quite tell if you've got an organization that you're working with right now, or if you're an independent consultant and you have these fantastic relationships. What's the best way for people to reach out to you?
Well, up until recently, when I retired, I was the technical director of a soil and water conservation district and worked through that venue to reach people, because that's an established organization where all kinds of individuals and groups engage in practices of conservation. So it really was a great pathway to involve people in my work. And the work continues. We have some grant-based projects through regional and statewide organizations like Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners. And, that work continues. And typically now the publicity and involvement is through the organizations that are planting trees or are interested in this. So I would say at this point, I work generally as a consultant ecologist with these different groups and sort of getting things organized. And I do like to speak to the public. So most groups have different talks and events. So it's pretty easy to get out there and get people interested in learning about this sort of thing.
I really appreciate you talking about the need for hope with addressing climate change. I think one of the things that I keep falling back on when I do hit those points of kind of what have we done is that we do know how to address it. It's not all is lost. The answers are there. It's a question of different people chipping in. And I'm well aware that large players have made a large impact and they need to chip in too, but we are not impotent. So having the opportunity to be part of a group that is helping the ecology along with the tree planting and understanding that we can learn from that really does mean something. So I appreciate you putting that in there.
Well, thank you.
I think what you're doing is really, really cool. I really appreciate you giving a call out to the Soil and Water District folks. It's an unknown in general to the general public how much work that those, they're not organizations in the way that most people think of like a nonprofit organization, but they do really great technical work. They exist all over the country. So that's a great place for people to start and look and to reach out to different land trusts, which I certainly have found is in some ways a unique organizational structure in Maine. I haven't lived anywhere else where land trusts have had such a vibrant impact in all sorts of great ways for communities. So I think that that's another way to go. And I want to thank you for your work and explaining assisted migration and the value and the importance of it. I think it's really cool stuff. And I really appreciate your long winding path and how you got here. I think it's fascinating and a good reminder to people out there that, sometimes it takes some of us a little while to find out what we really want to do. And sometimes we find out that we want to do multiple things in the span of a lifetime, and that's okay too.
Absolutely. And Kate, thank you so much for having me on your show and being interested in these ideas. And I am certainly open to people contacting me that have questions or want to pursue this sort of thing. I can certainly steer them in the right direction. And I would also mention to your listeners, if they want to learn more about this, a great place to start is the website forestadaptation.org. And they have a lot of resources that are very readable and usable by the general public to learn about climate and its impacts on nature.
Excellent. We will put that in the show notes along with contact information for you. And I really appreciate this. Keep it going. Keep up the really cool work.
Okay, Kate, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by following us on your podcast platform of choice. And please leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is executive produced and hosted by me, Kate Dickerson, and edited and produced by Scott Loiselle. And the Discover Maine theme was composed and performed by Nick Parker.